This graph outlines how many adults in Aotearoa smoke tobacco every day. There's a massive decline until here, where for the first time in 10 years, cigarette smoking did not meaningfully decrease year on year. This was purposeful. It took decades of public health policies, scare campaigns, and activism to achieve this. This is also purposeful. It's taken decades of tobacco lobbying, revolving door politics, and propaganda to achieve. So how did Aotearoa go from being virtually smoke-free in 2020 to performing worse on tobacco policy than Rishi think tank Sunak?
So I propose that in future, we raise the smoking age by 1 year every year.
That's what we're going to talk about today. How tobacco lobbying, revolving door politics, and propaganda are eroding tobacco controls. So I want to start by showing you this document. It's a Philip Morris lobbying document out of Japan, and this document is extremely detailed, offering a blueprint for how Philip Morris International influences public policy. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism broke down this document and outlined an aggressive lobbying campaign to secure a lower tax rate for its heated tobacco products, such as IQOS, compared to traditional cigarettes, get their heated tobacco products exempt from indoor smoking bans, and to target politicians, government officials, and even the healthcare industry. We're going to talk about IQOS a lot, so for the uninitiated, the IQOS is a hybrid between an e-cigarette and a cigarette. You put these tobacco sticks, basically just a cigarette, inside the device, and the device heats the tobacco stick rather than burning it. While Philip Morris claims that this reduces harm by about 90% by avoiding actual smoke production, experts caution that the risks may still be comparable to conventional smoking. Despite international safeguards such as the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, a 2003 treaty designed to prevent industry influence on public health policy, Japan's lax lobbying laws meant that Philip Morris International could operate without the risk of sanction. Philip Morris International's Japan strategy was extensive. The company planned to map 100 parliamentarians for targeted lobbying on tobacco harm reduction, leverage international conferences to push its narrative, and sponsor public health seminars, including one titled Roles of Science and Policy in the Pandemic Society, and they even wanted to infiltrate the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, seeking a Philip Morris Japan presence at the Olympic venue. Perhaps the most unexpected element of this strategy was Philip Morris International's plan to target Japanese dentists. The company aimed to enlist dentists to advocate for heated tobacco products as a harm reduction device. Philip Morris insists that heated tobacco products are a victory for harm reduction, but independent studies have found little conclusive evidence to support these claims, and the long-term health effects aren't entirely clear. What is clear, though, is that heated tobacco products have been an enormous financial success for Philip Morris. In 2023, heated tobacco products outsold traditional cigarettes in Japan by more than 2 to 1. Philip Morris International's smoke-free product division, led by IQOS, now generates over $13 billion annually, more than their most famous cigarette brand, Marlboro. The heated tobacco products have been a lifesaver for the tobacco industry, and IQOS has been a life raft for Philip Morris. The strategy outlined in this document to push IQOS and HTPs is one being rolled out across the globe. In 2024, Radio New Zealand reported on a leaked strategy document written by Philip Morris in 2017, this time outlining the strategy for Aotearoa. Though this document has not leaked in full, we can compare the reports to the Japanese document and start to extrapolate from there. The most important revelation made by Radio New Zealand was that Philip Morris International sought to target New Zealand First and Te Pāti Māori. The specific reasoning behind PMI's focus on these two specific parties remains unclear, but we can infer possible motivations. New Zealand First has known connections to the tobacco industry, but we'll explore that a little later on. Those connections make it an obvious target for lobbying. Meanwhile, Te Pāti Māori, a party representing Tangata Whenua, may have been seen as a strategic target due to the disproportionately high smoking rates among Māori. PMI actively exploits these disproportionately high smoking rates to push its alternative nicotine products. Data from Te Whatu Ora for 2023 and 2024 shows that while daily smoking rates have declined over the last 5 years, inequities persist. 14.7% of Māori adults smoke, compared to just 6.1% for Europeans. Historically, Māori had no tobacco use before colonization. However, since its introduction in the 18th century, smoking has disproportionately harmed Māori communities. Today, Māori are 2.6 times more likely to become current smokers than non-Māori, and Pacific people are 1.9 times more likely than non-Pacific people, even when adjusted for age and gender. Smoking rates are particularly high among Māori women, with maternal smoking rates postnatally at 19.5% as of 2021. Statistically, Māori women have the highest smoking rates in Aotearoa, about 37%, nearly 3 times the national average. Philip Morris is capitalizing on this reality, aggressively marketing its IQOS devices to Māori through what it calls community activations. The company runs promotional events at marae and other venues with high Māori and Pacifica populations, offering discounts and incentives. Shane Kawinata Bradbrook, a longtime advocate for smoke-free Māori communities, is outraged by Philip Morris's tactics. He says that instead of jumping off the 10th floor, you're jumping off the 6th. It's still harmful. It's highly addictive, and that's what they do. They hook people for life. They screw them out of their money, and let's be honest, Māori are the ones who can least afford that. This is an important point. In our video on school lunches, we discussed the breakdown of wealth in Aotearoa. We discussed a 2015 release by Stats New Zealand, and we outlined how the median net wealth of European people was more than 5 times that of Māori. Philip Morris wants to position their heated tobacco devices as legitimate harm reduction tools, arguing that it helps smokers quit traditional cigarettes, but independent research challenges this claim. A 2018 study in Italy found that nearly half of the 740,000 people who tried IQOS were never smokers, raising fears that it might just create new generations of nicotine addicts. We'll talk about this more in a while. Emails obtained by Radio New Zealand show that in June of 2019, Philip Morris approached Auckland Action Against Poverty, a frontline advocacy group. Green MP Ricardo Menendez March, who runs the group, rejected their offer of assistance outright. He said, "I think it's disingenuous and quite frankly disgusting for Philip Morris to be approaching groups that work at the front lines with low-income communities under the pretense that they're just there to help low-income people switch to less harmful products. They're just trying to find avenues to target low-income communities to make a profit, and so I'm quite appalled that this is a tactic a corporation is using." Counties Manukau DHB also refused Philip Morris's offer. Public health physician Dr. Doon Winard responded bluntly, "We work with people who do intend to quit smoking, and while Philip Morris claims to want a smoke-free world, the reality is their company has not stopped selling tobacco." Though Philip Morris insists that IQOS is about providing better options, not just making money, their push into rugby league clubs offering free 2-week trials and referral bonuses, that seems shady at best. Philip Morris once marketed light and mild cigarettes as safer alternatives, so it's hard to believe that IQOS isn't just another tobacco product in disguise. Tobacco has been regulated in Aotearoa for almost 180 years. For now, we're going to focus on a 2021 legislation passed by the Labour government under Jacinda Ardern. The Smokefree Aotearoa 2025 action plan had 3 underlying branches. 1. The Smokefree Generation Law, which aims to ban cigarette sales for anyone born after January 1st, 2009, ensuring that future generations would never become addicted to cigarettes. 2. Cutting the number of retailers selling tobacco by 90%, making cigarettes much harder to access. 3. Mandating a reduction in nicotine levels to non-addictive levels, making cigarettes less appealing and much easier to quit. Public health experts and youth advocacy groups overwhelmingly supported the plan. A study by the Department of Public Health, University of Otago, interviewed Kiwi youth and found that most viewed the Smoke-Free Generation Law as a step forward rather than a restriction, seeing it as a way to protect future generations from addiction. Even among those who initially opposed the law, many changed their stance when considering the long-term benefits. However, in 2024, the newly elected coalition government repealed these landmark policies.
New Zealand's newly formed coalition government's made its first move. It's axing its world-leading smoking ban to fund tax cuts.
The Smoke-Free Generation Law was scrapped, the planned reduction in retailers was abandoned, and the nicotine levels in cigarettes are no longer set to be reduced. One of the more contentious moves was a tax cut on heated tobacco products, a tax cut for which more than $200 million was set aside. Leading up to the 2023 election of the coalition government, daily smoking rates had dropped significantly from 16.4% in 2011-2012 to 6.8% in 2022-2023. But in the years since the election, cigarette smoking use failed to decline for the first time in a decade, sitting at 6.9%, up from 6.8% in 2022-2023. The loosening of the smoking laws came at a time when tobacco use was at an all-time low, and their impacts are almost immediately apparent. The face of these changes has been Casey Costello. Casey Costello is currently serving as Minister of Customs, Minister for Seniors, and the Associate Minister of Health within the coalition government. A longtime advocate of right-wing policies, Casey Costello has been a vocal critic of Māori-specific government initiatives and previously served as a trustee for Hobson's Pledge, a lobbying group that opposes the role of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in governance. Beyond that, Costello has deep ties to the Taxpayers Union. She previously served as both a board member and a chairperson of the organization, a role that deserves scrutiny due to its links to the Philip Morris lobbying strategy. It's Casey Costello's role as Associate Minister of Health that demands our attention. As Associate Minister, Costello has been the face of the repeal of Labour's tobacco control measures. Her critics, including public health experts and opposition MPs, have accused her of promoting tobacco industry interests, an allegation she's denied despite leaked documents linking her office to pro-tobacco narratives. She later faced rebuke from the Chief Ombudsman for withholding information on her tobacco policies from journalists and academics. To fully understand what's happening, we need to rewind to 2017 and go back to the Philip Morris strategy document. We know that Philip Morris planned to target New Zealand First and Te Pāti Māori, two political parties often heavily involved in the parliamentary makeup, and they also wanted to target the Taxpayers Union and the New Zealand Initiative, leveraging their existing influence. Philip Morris has defended its lobbying efforts, stating that HTPs were sold in 70 countries worldwide and were typically taxed lower than cigarettes due to their reduced harm. The company also dismissed opposition, calling it the work of a small cohort who hold a vested interest in our silence. Perhaps most bafflingly, Costello has compared the harm of nicotine to that of caffeine, a statement that we'll examine in detail later on.
Nicotine is as harmful as caffeine, but its association with smoking has seen the poorest punished by huge taxes.
So now that we've established the key players and their connections, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
I thought there would be extremely difficult. We've made strides in New Zealand and Australia.
But that's the thing, right? Especially in difficult markets or markets with heavy, strict regulations, all you have to do to circumvent that is to go into the grey channels.
No, but I'm talking about making government payments.
Oh no, we don't do that explicitly in Australia and New Zealand. But government payments are not a problem for us because these are extremely, how should I put it, subtle. It's just like how the big tobacco does it, right? They go through like multiple shell companies and associations and consultants and agencies and whatnot. And it's almost, you need to have a very persistent investigative journalist to find out it. Or have all is recorded.
The recordings you just heard were taken in 2023 inside one of China's largest vaping companies. Whistleblowers from the company took the recordings to the Sunday Times with claims that their employer was coordinating vape shipments to countries where vapes were illegal. One of the recordings captures two company employees discussing a Bloomberg journalist who was investigating the company's operations in Malaysia. They deliberated on conducting a background check on her and agreed to lie about the company's sales practices, sticking to the official narrative that their vapes did not contain nicotine within Malaysia. However, as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that some of the company's stores were indeed selling nicotine products, despite their official denials.
And the thing is though too, I don't know, did they tell you that we're already selling these non-compliant products in the UK as well?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. We have them all over the world.
The conversation suggests the company was well aware of its illegal activities and had systematically spread these products worldwide. The part that caught my eye in the eyes of health experts across the globe was when the discussion turned to bribes allegedly made in New Zealand and Australia. Though the name of this company wasn't published in the 2024 article, parliamentary discussions in January of 2025 tentatively identified the name of this company as ReLX. ReLX was awarded a government contract worth $500,000 for their vaping devices. When asked by the opposition why the government approved funding for ReLX vapes despite their lack of MedSafe approval, Casey Costello insisted that the procurement process was followed correctly and that the product was compliant and safe.
Why is her government funding ReLX vapes as smoking cessation devices when, unlike all other smoking cessation tools, they have not been approved by MedSafe and have not been through a robust procurement process?
The procurement process has been complied with. The product is completely compliant and safe. It is supplied by a company with no affiliations to the tobacco industry, and it is completely compliant product and New Zealand owned. The issue that we're talking about is that this product is being funded by the Innovation Fund as a tool to apply to alternative products that will help smokers quit smoking. It is only provided through quit smoking services and only to adult smokers and only to those who have committed to a program of quit smoking.
Opposition MPs pressed further, citing the leaked recordings. Green Party MP Pu Hanu-Linden directly confronted Costello with the quote.
Bribes in New Zealand and Australia?
But that's the thing, right? Especially in difficult markets or markets with heavy, strict regulations, all you have to do to circumvent that is to go into the grey channels.
What is her response to the leaked recordings of our ReLX employees stating, quote, "We've made effing bribes in New Zealand and Australia," end quote? That's the thing, right? Especially in difficult markets or markets with heavy, strict regulations, all you have to do is circumnavigate them is to go into grey channels, end quote.
Mr. Speaker, my response to that summation of quotes is the fact that she's missed out the section where the people in the recording are saying, no, 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 that's not what we do. And also that this is a 2023 recording in Singapore, which has no connection to New Zealand markets or New Zealanders.
What is her response to leaked recordings of ReLX employees stating, quote, "I'm talking about making like government payments," and in response, quote, "We don't do that visibly in Australia and New Zealand, but government payments are not a problem for us because these are extremely, how do I put it, subtle," end quote.
Mr. Speaker, the inference that this New Zealand government has received bribes is abhorrent, and I reject the premise of that question.
Costello deflected, claiming the recordings had been taken out of context and occurred in Singapore with no connection to Aotearoa. I personally struggle to accept this. The whistleblower recordings explicitly mention bribery in Aotearoa and Australia. The employees in the recording were discussing actions allegedly taken in Aotearoa. Costello's argument is a red herring that distracts from the core issue, which is whether or not the company engaged in corrupt practices in Aotearoa.
Mr. Speaker, why did the government approve the purchase of $575,000 worth of vaping products from RELX, a company accused of bribing the New Zealand government?
As that member was just told, the date of that so-called phone call was to a government that she was a member of with the help of the Greens in 2023. So any implication of a bribery comes straight back to her own back door. Now, having dismissed that, because I don't believe it did happen in that way, I think it's a typical Green fiction.
When co-deputy to the Prime Minister Winston Peters was questioned, he dismissed the bribery allegations as a typical Green fiction and attempted to shift blame onto the previous government, claiming any wrongdoing would have occurred under their watch in 2023. Let's be real though, if Winston Peters even half believed that someone on the left was engaged in bribery, he'd be screaming it from the rooftops. But instead, he's conveniently ignoring the fact that New Zealand First was specifically named as a lobbying target by Philip Morris. What these recordings describe, using shell companies and think tanks and so on to filter money, none of that is illegal and it's technically not bribery. But this brings us to a key concept in systems thinking, which is that the purpose of a system is what it does. If a system consistently produces a certain outcome, regardless of intent, then that outcome is the true purpose of the system. In this case, if money is being funneled through complex channels to gain influence, whether or not it meets the legal definition of bribery sort of becomes secondary to the fact that it achieves the same end. The strategies outlined in the leaked recordings are almost the same strategies employed by think tanks. From my time reading about think tanks, I've come to understand the process as follows. A company, in this case a big tobacco company, pays money to an international think tank. That think tank donates money to a local lobbying group. That lobbying group does all the grunt work on the ground level. So let's unpack how this happens in Aotearoa and in the wider world. If you've already seen any of my previous videos, then you'll probably find some of the next little bit mildly repetitive, so I'll try and balance repetition while acknowledging that some folks might not know all of the players involved in the wider think tank sphere. We're going to start with the libertarian think tank, the Atlas Network, who for over 4 decades has quietly worked as the head of a global web of right-wing or radical centrist think tanks. We're starting with Atlas because for almost every endpoint we have, they can all be traced back to Atlas. Atlas is chaired by Kiwi woman Debbie Gibbs, whose parents are some of the ACT Party's largest donors. Debbie Gibbs became the chair for Atlas in 2013, and Atlas has, under her tenure, taken donations from multiple big tobacco companies. The Atlas Network listed British American Tobacco as a donor in its 2016 and 2015 annual reports, and Japan Tobacco International as a donor in its 2016 annual report. But the relationship between Big Tobacco and the Atlas Network goes back by multiple decades. The since-deleted 2004 edition of PR Watch detailed how Philip Morris funneled $475,000 to Atlas in 1995, followed by another $150,000 in 1997. From Atlas, this money is paid to smaller, more hyper-local think tanks. With this money, these local think tanks host events, conferences, and so forth, where they discuss pro-industry talking points. Here, they'll invite politicians and economists to discuss how deregulation will promote choice and economic freedom. They downplay or dismiss health or environmental concerns. In short, they're teaching other, more influential people on how to promote the donating industry. A 2016 research paper by authors at Simon Fraser University in Canada analyzed the relationship between Atlas and Big Tobacco. They wrote that, during the 1990s, the tobacco industry strategically collaborated with free market think tanks, particularly through the Atlas Network, to influence public policy and counter growing tobacco control efforts. Documents examined in the paper outlined how two authors, James Bennett and Thomas J. DiLorenzo, received covert payments from RJR Tobacco via Atlas to write books such as Unhealthy Charities and Cancer Scam, which criticized public health organizations and framed tobacco regulation as government overreach. The tobacco industry leverages Atlas partners, including the Heritage Foundation, Mont Pelerin Society, and Independent Institute, to disseminate industry-friendly narratives while layering their funding sources to keep them opaque. Think tanks like the Cato Institute and the Heartland Institute play a key role in amplifying these arguments through publications, op-eds, and direct engagement with policymakers. The industry's use of think tanks has created a network of seemingly independent voices that reinforce pro-tobacco messaging, undermine public health efforts, and oppose federal lawsuits against tobacco companies. While the full extent of ongoing funding remains unclear due to limited disclosure, the findings suggest a deliberate and sustained effort to manipulate policy debate. One of these independent voices, affiliated with the Atlas Network, is the New Zealand Taxpayers Union. The New Zealand Taxpayers Union was founded by Jordan Williams and actively engages in pro-capitalist, anti-regulation organizing. Newsroom revealed that British American Tobacco is among the New Zealand Taxpayers Union funders. The Guardian also identified the relationship between the Taxpayers Union and British American Tobacco back in 2019. A British American Tobacco spokesperson confirmed the link with Newsroom, saying, "We, like many other companies, support like-minded organizations on issues that are important to us and our consumers." The Taxpayers Union has repeatedly criticized tobacco control policy, including annual rises to the tobacco excise tax and the introduction of plain packaging laws. Jordan Williams, through his company, the Campaign Company, has also been behind multiple AstroTurf campaigns, political operations designed as grassroots movements. Among them, the We Belong Aotearoa campaign, an initiative opposing co-governance in Te Tiriti Waitangi using liberal multiculturalist rhetoric to sound appealing, and the Save Our Stores campaign, an anti-smoke-free initiative designed to resist tobacco regulation. Throughout August of 2023, Facebook ads promoted a petition to Save Our Stores. The ads linked to a website that asked people to sign in support of repealing the Smokefree 2025 Act. Specifically, the part where this law would reduce the number of stores selling cigarettes from 6,000 to 600 by July of 2024. The campaign appeared to be run by small business owners, with a dairy owner named Bhavesh from Lower Hutt featured on the site. However, in the small print at the bottom of the page, it says the campaign is backed by British American Tobacco, New Zealand, and Imperial Brand, two big tobacco companies. The website's privacy policy also confirmed that it was run by these two companies. The campaign encouraged shop owners to display posters in their stores that say, "This dairy is under the threat of closure," with a QR code linking back to the website. When asked about their involvement, the tobacco companies declined interviews. In a statement, they said they were helping small shop owners speak out about the impact of the law, but they did not directly answer whether it was clear that tobacco companies were behind the campaign. The companies also claimed Bhavesh was the campaign's main voice. However, when Radio New Zealand tried to contact Bhavesh, the tobacco companies said he had chosen to stay private. Shortly after Radio New Zealand's inquiry, Bhavesh's photo was removed from the website. Radio New Zealand did find a store owner named Bhavesh in Lower Hutt, but when he was contacted, he said he was away and he wasn't sure what they were referring to. It's unclear if this Bhavesh is the same Bhavesh featured in the campaign. The tobacco companies argued that store owners would have to pay high fees to apply for a license to sell cigarettes under the new law. They say that they created the website to help these businesses inform their communities about the challenges that they were facing. Some of the messages featured in the campaign warned of increased crime and gang control if fewer stores could sell cigarettes. According to Facebook data, the ads were seen up to 200,986 times and cost between $1,300 and $2,686 to promote. The tobacco companies did not answer questions about who was paying for the ads or whether some of their claims were misleading. Sonny Kaushal, chair of the Dairy and Business Owners Group, which represents around 6,000 small businesses, said that his group had no connection to the Save Our Stores campaign. While he acknowledged that many shop owners do worry about losing revenue, he said the decline of smoking made this inevitable. His group is pushing for changes, such as delaying the law by 18 months and lowering taxes on low-nicotine tobacco to encourage smokers to switch. He also believes that dairies should be able to suggest alternative products like vapes, which they currently can't do. Ben Yowden from Smokefree advocacy group Ash NZ said he understands shop owners' concerns but worries they're being used by the tobacco industry. He and public health advocate Shane Bradbrook said that these tactics are not new, pointing to past campaigns where tobacco companies secretly backed similar protests against smoking laws. A similar situation happened in the UK in 2008 when British MPs unknowingly supported a campaign they thought was led by small retailers, but was actually funded by the tobacco industry. Bradbrook called the Save Our Stores campaign just another example of the tobacco industry trying to fight government policies that aim to reduce smoking. So again, my problem with the Save Our Stores campaign and those who propound these arguments is that it supposes that 300,000 smokers are the only thing keeping every dairy in the country from going bust. This is an important argument to fight back against because it was used to justify the repeal of the Smokefree 2025 Act. Health professor Janet Hook from the University of Otago criticized the Save Our Stores campaign, saying tobacco companies claim to be moving forward towards less harmful products but continue to support cigarette sales. She also questioned the claim that 6,000 shops rely on tobacco for 55% of their revenue. Professor Hook was part of a research study in 2018 which examined the prevalence of tobacco purchases in dairies in Dunedin. Out of the 679 total purchases that they looked at, only 14% included tobacco products. The most frequently purchased item overall was takeaway food and snacks, making up 54% of all items purchased. Soft drinks were the second most common at 22%, while tobacco ranked third at 8%, the same percentage as essential grocery items like milk, bread, and eggs combined. I want to be transparent though and make it clear that the percentage of transactions that included tobacco varied greatly between stores, ranging from 1% in one store to 45% in another store. In 6 stores, tobacco made up more than 25% of all sales. This variation likely reflects differences in store policies and pricing. For example, one store where nearly half of all purchases included tobacco sold it at a discount. In general, stores with more customer traffic had fewer tobacco purchases compared to stores with fewer customers. Save Our Stores is just one example of how industry narratives are spread using hyperlocal think tanks. One of the most effective ways pro-industry messaging seeps into the public consciousness is through the media itself. Not necessarily via advertising dollars, but by who holds the power to shape the news. Let's start with this man, Rupert Murdoch. Best known for Fox News, Murdoch has long been entangled with major corporate power players, but most importantly, the tobacco industry. As far back as 1989, Murdoch was on the board of directors for Philip Morris. Murdoch's first foreign media acquisition was in Aotearoa in the 1960s. He outmaneuvered a Canadian rival to take control of the Dominion newspaper, prompting then Prime Minister Keith Holyoake to push through legislation limiting foreign media ownership. However, rather than stopping Murdoch's influence, the bill was widely criticized as an attempt to consolidate political control over the press. Decades later, in 2022, Murdoch's News Corp was reportedly plotting a return to Aotearoa, eyeing an expansion through The Australian, a right-leaning publication known for pushing conservative and pro-business narratives. While this move seemed modest, it was enough to reignite debates about Murdoch's impact on political discourse. Though Murdoch hasn't overtly operated in Aotearoa for much of this century, he isn't truly absent. His Sky News Australia, a Fox News-style channel notorious for its inflammatory far-right commentary, broadcast domestically via Sky TV. Figures like Andrew Bolt and Rowan Dean routinely use their platforms to attack progressive policies, Indigenous rights, and anything that they deem woke. While it's unlikely that Murdoch personally micromanages every Kiwi-related story, the influence of his media empire is undeniable. Of course, Murdoch isn't the only conduit for industry messaging. Another intriguing figure in this ever-tangled yarn is Luke Malpass, a former research fellow at the Atlas-affiliated think tank, the New Zealand Initiative, who now serves as the political editor for Stuff. I don't mention this to try and accuse Luke Malpass of turning Stuff into an Atlas mouthpiece, but I'm hoping we can start to see how each of these individual cogs creates a global machine that conducts an osmosis for industry messaging to permeate the mainstream. I also think it's worth it to note that Nicola Willis, the current Minister for Finance in the national-led coalition government, is also heavily affiliated with the New Zealand Initiative. We've covered that in a previous video, but it's important to mention again because NZI has written articles that praise the current coalition government's approach to tobacco control. Past Willis, Chris Bishop is the current MP for Hutt South, and as of January 2025 is the Minister for Transport in the National Party. In the early 2010s, Bishop worked as a corporate affairs manager at Philip Morris International. In 2019, he argued that tobacco was legal and that companies are entitled to representation. As a tobacco lobbyist, Bishop worked against the national government's plans to increase excise on tobacco and plain packaging of tobacco. Although he's since flip-flopped on this position and now claims that he supports the changes. Which, isn't it great to agree with something after it's already happened? At the same time that Bishop was selected to stand against Trevor Mallard in Hutt South, Todd Barclay was picked to stand in the South Island electorate of Clutha Southland. Todd Barclay is another Philip Morris man. Barclay was still working at Philip Morris at the time that he was selected by the National Party. Barclay immediately claimed that he was anti-smoking and had joined the company to gain real-world experience. Which makes me laugh because what? I feel like you would get more real-world experience working a single shift at the Manor Street McDonald's on a Saturday night. Barclay's definition of real-world experience makes much more sense when you learn that his maiden speech in Parliament espoused the virtues of Margaret Thatcher.
As British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher once said, "We want a society where people are free to make choices, to make mistakes, to be generous and compassionate. This is what we mean by a moral society, not a society where the state is responsible for everything and no one is responsible for the state."
Barclay lost 3 staff members to resignations in 2016, and his political career came to a hilarious end mid-2017 when it emerged that he'd been making clandestine recordings of staff members he suspected of being critical of him.
Just after lunch today, after what have clearly been robust discussions behind closed doors in the Beehive, the 27-year-old Clutha Southland MP released a statement effectively chucking in his political career.
Todd Barclay has been under pressure to resign after controversy over secret recordings he's accused of making of a staffer in the Gore electorate office.
Barclay announced that he would not stand for re-election that year. Moving away from the MPs but hovering like flies over the shit that is the National Party, we move slightly across to Barbara Luxon, the sister-in-law of the Prime Minister Christopher Luxon. Barbara has worked as a trade and marketing coordinator at British American Tobacco New Zealand for 19 years, according to her own LinkedIn profile. So let's round this off by doing a twofer with David Broom, who was the Chief of Staff for New Zealand First between 2014 and 2017, and who is now the External Relations Manager at Philip Morris, and Apirana Dawson, who was the Director of Operations and Research in the Office of Winston Peters between 2013 and 2017, and who led the election campaigns for New Zealand First in 2014 and 2017, and who is now the Philip Morris Director of External Affairs. Perhaps most curiously is the 2017 sale of a 316-hectare beef and cattle farm in Waipapa, Northland to Andre Kalantzopoulos, the CEO of Philip Morris. The property, located between Kirikiri and the Pukete Forest, falls within the electorate of local MP Winston Peters. I point this out because this sale happened about a year before IQOS became widely available in the Kiwi marketplace. Kalantzopoulos was the fellow leading Philip Morris's push to introduce alternative to cigarettes. As I like to do, I want to make it clear I'm not making any kind of accusations in Winston Peters' directions in this case. In this case, the only people I am pointing my fingers at are the people at Philip Morris who in 2017 authored a document on their heated tobacco product strategies that included targeting New Zealand first, of whom Winston Peters was and is the leader, and in whose electorate the CEO of Philip Morris purchased a property. What we're seeing here, with industry insiders and politicians swapping places, it's called revolving door politics. The revolving door between government and industry ensures that industry interests are always represented in policy making without direct lobbying, as former insiders shape policy from within the government. If politicians, advisors, and think tanks are already advocating for industry-friendly policies, then direct lobbying becomes redundant. This is how big industry, the Atlas Network, and its affiliated think tanks are able to influence policy. In short, there's no overt bribery or corruption, only systems designed to produce pro-industry outcomes regardless of public interests. The purpose of a system is what it does. And in this case, the system ensures that corporate influence remains entrenched in policy no matter who holds office. It starts to feel quite spread out, quite diffuse, and in that diffusion it's easy to deny any direct involvement from one point to the other. It's like this by design. It means that any one person or organization can feasibly deny connections to any other person or organization.
Do the ACT Party have any links or connections to the Atlas Group?
No.
There are so many layers and different points of entry that connecting the dots starts to look a bit like that Always Sunny gif of the kooky conspiracy guy. I don't know, I've never seen It's Always Sunny. David Seymour has taken advantage of how detangling this knot makes people look. When confronted on his relationship to Atlas by Mata in 2024, David wrote the relationship off as being the new Pizzagate conspiracy of the left.
Well, if you're about to go into the new Pizzagate of the left conspiracy theory...
What's that, the Pizzagate?
That's some crazy conspiracy theory that Trumpists have in the US.
The campaign in Australia had links to the Atlas Network, a network of think tanks which promote individual liberty and free enterprise, and it said that the network pushes opinion pieces in favour of free speech. Do the ACT Party have any links or connections to the Atlas Group?
No. I can't believe you're doing this. I've read about this conspiracy theory and you're actually running it, but that's cool.
Well, no, I'm just trying to understand it because we went to Australia and we analysed.
Obviously, it's a conspiracy in that people are conspiring against others, but it's not a theory. How's a man gonna sit there and say he has no relationship to Atlas 2 years after appearing on video at an Atlas event with Atlas signage all over the place? This tactic works because the average Kiwi has been inundated with actual, real conspiracy theorists for the better part of a decade now.
Tēnā tātou katoa, good evening. The battle for Parliament has erupted after police stormed the anti-mandate occupation to take the front lawn back from protesters.
For every one connection that a politician has to the Atlas Network, there are 10 cookers on Facebook screaming about how getting immunized against measles is going to make your legs turn to squid tentacles. For every one insidious law that the coalition passes, there are 10 yokels outside screaming about how they're the Sheriff Queen of Australia and they're invoking the Magna Carta to secure the army and take the country by force. We are living in a hotbed of conspiracy theories, and this environment makes it really easy for the average person to become jaded when they hear stuff like, the government is a coalition made up of National, New Zealand First, ACT, and the Atlas Network. And when they have the regional co-deputy to the Prime Minister on TV telling them that those links are like Pizzagate, a conspiracy theory that led to gun violence, then of course the average person just turns off and they don't want to hear it. Tobacco is dead. The children don't appreciate a good Virginia Slim anymore, and the art of the cigarette packet is a distant memory. So let's take a look at how we got here. Smoking came to Aotearoa with the earliest European colonizers. By the early 1850s, approximately a kilogram of tobacco was being smoked per person each year, or about 21 grams a week. Consumption rose throughout the 1860s, and by 1864, almost 3.5 kilograms per person was being smoked. It wasn't for nearly 20 years that consumption dropped, falling to just short of a kilogram per person in 1890. Tobacco was heavily taxed with customs duties, which trebled between 1841 and 1879. Tobacco was also subject to excise taxes, but these taxes were purely for revenue and not to disincentivize smoking. The first real moves against smoking in Aotearoa took place in 1876 when the government of the time decided to ban indoor smoking in the old Parliament building because they were scared it would burn the place down. Then, about 7 years later, in 1883, a group called the Anti-Nicotine Society started campaigning off the idea that smoking led to other vices such as drunkenness. Anti-tobacco measures were taken sporadically throughout the 1900s. The Juvenile Smoking Suppression Act of 1903 prohibited supply to anyone under the age of 15, and then in 1907 the government moved to ban tobacco sales to people under the age of 16. There was a consensus, it seemed, that tobacco could stunt a minor's growth. This law wasn't really well enforced, and only 100 people had been prosecuted in the 7 years leading to 1914. It wasn't until 1988 that tobacco sales to minors were actively restricted. In 1945, the first New Zealand Health Department warning against smoking appeared. Cigarette advertising was banned on TV and radio in 1963, in cinemas and billboards in 1971, and finally in print media in 1990. Text-only health warnings were added to tobacco packaging in 1974, and in 1987, new heart and lung disease warnings were also added to the packets. About 5,000 Kiwi were dying each year from smoking-related illnesses by the late 1980s, or about 1 in 5 all-adult deaths. It was around this time in the late 1980s and early 1990s that the Kiwi government introduced a range of measures, including age restrictions on sales, higher taxes on tobacco products, restrictions on cigarette advertising and sponsorship, warnings on cigarette packets, the creation of smoke-free areas, and assistance towards quitting. Smoking on domestic flights was banned in 1988 and on all international flights as of 1996. One of the most enduring pieces of legislation to come out of this era was the Smokefree Environments Act of 1990, which was passed to prevent the effects of passive smoking on other people by restricting cigarette smoking in places such as workplaces and schools. Tobacco sponsorship was phased out in 1995, and tobacco signage was banned from outside stores that very same year. Tobacco displays themselves were banned in 2012. By 1997, the age restriction on cigarettes was finally increased to 18 years, and the sale of single cigarettes was banned in early 1998, with cigarettes required to be sold in packs of no fewer than 20. On the 3rd of December 2003, the government of Aotearoa passed an amendment to the Smokefree Environments Act, which covered all indoor public workplaces and hospitality venues. Outdoor smoke-free laws cover the grounds of all schools, some council-owned parks, the grounds of some hospitals, stadiums, and most university campuses. Now, it's great exploring the history of tobacco control, but I want to zero in on one specific piece of legislation, which is an amendment to the Smokefree Environments Act from 2016. But to understand how we got there, we need to rewind 6 years to October 2010, when the Māori Affairs Select Committee launched an inquiry into the tobacco industry in Aotearoa and the impact of tobacco use on Māori. In their report to Parliament, the committee recommended a suite of tobacco control measures aimed at reducing smoking rates and limiting tobacco availability. The committee also proposed a national goal of reducing smoking rates to below 5% by 2025, effectively making Aotearoa a smoke-free nation. In March of 2011, the government formally adopted the Smoke-Free 2025 goal. The recommendation we're focusing on is the push for tobacco products to be sold in standardized packaging. Standardized packaging was introduced under the Smoke-Free Environments Tobacco Standardized Packaging Amendment Act 2016, which, try saying that 5 times fast. The objectives of this legislation were to reduce the appeal of smoking and tobacco products, further diminishing their social and cultural acceptance, making health warnings more prominent, and preventing consumers from developing misleading perceptions about tobacco's harmful effects. Additionally, the regulations mandated that new, larger pictorial health warnings covered 75% of the front and 100% of the back of cigarette packets. These regulations came into force on March 14, 2018. Notably, Aotearoa became the first country in the world to regulate cigarette stick sizes, both in length and diameter, effectively banning slim cigarettes. The law also restricted cigarette pack sizes to 20 or 25 cigarettes and limited loose tobacco packages to 30 grams or 50 grams. I think the part that boggles my mind is that much of this legislation was passed under national. I think this matters because it kind of points out just how absurd the Coalition's decision to dismantle tobacco control law really is. For most of the 2000s and 2010s, tobacco regulation was not a partisan issue, and both Labour and National supported tobacco control. The only parties consistently opposed to this have been ACT and New Zealand First. So, what changed? Why did National go from adopting Smokefree 2025 and strengthening tobacco regulations to actively dismantling them, especially when even Rishi UK crime bill Sunak was trying to implement similar policies? For me, personally, I see three possible answers. A. The rise of vapes and heated tobacco products. Smoking rates have declined as users switch to alternatives, and pro-business politicians can now argue that anti-smoking legislation is probably unnecessary because fewer people are smoking. Therefore, as far as they see it, mission accomplished. Option B. It was part of the coalition deal. ACT and New Zealand First have consistently opposed tobacco control, and National was willing to sacrifice these regulations if it meant that Luxon got to be Prime Minister. Or C. Reactionary politics. Let me explain this one a bit further. The Labour government under Jacinda Ardern leaned into ideas like co-governance, which didn't sit well with Atlas-adjacent groups like the Taxpayers Union.
This Auckland event is the latest in a nationwide anti-co-governance tour.
If you've got problems with co-governance, that's kei te pai, but you shouldn't have to use racism to make that point.
Unfounded claims, including that co-governance is led by tribal elites who withhold treaty settlement money from their people, appear to be resonating with attendees.
It's the Maori people's elites, iwi leaders, etc.,
So just to be clear, you have no evidence that this is happening, and you can't name a single, Maori elite.
It's not that I can't, I'm not going to.
I can tell Michael's mood by which comedy routine he chooses to do. The more infantile, the more upset he is.
I covered Groundswell in a previous video, so I won't get too into the details here, but their backlash to Three Waters in particular seemed to mark the point where reactionary politics became the norm. To recap a little bit, Groundswell was fiercely opposed to the Three Waters Initiative, a government proposal to centralize water infrastructure following a 2016 Campylobacter outbreak in Havelock North. National campaigned in 2023 on repealing Three Waters, and while that topic does deserve a video of its own, this is a video about smoking, so I'll just leave that there. National's U-turn on smoking regulations makes much more sense when you consider the state of reactionary politics right now. It's the same reason why they scrapped the IREX ferries only to end up back in talks with the same builders. It's just knee-jerk reactionary nonsense. In my last video, I said I couldn't understand why David Seymour called sushi woke, but I think I figured it out.
Oh, look, if you don't get that sushi is woke, I don't know how to wake you up.
It's simply because it was a school lunch served under Labour. That's all it takes now. We're at a point, stoked by think tanks, where any kind of forward momentum must be opposed at all costs, simply because the other guy suggested it. I don't think I need to spell this out. We can all feel the global polarization happening around us, and we've reached a point where if Labour says jump, the coalition says dive. If Labour says smoking is unhealthy and this is a well-established fact, the coalition says, but is it though? And if it is, landlords need their handouts and hospitals are being privatized, so I hope you don't mind secondhand smoke and its related illnesses. Hypothetically, of course. But at the end of the day, it really does feel like these decisions are being made purely in reaction to Labour, the Greens, or Te Pāti Māori, rather than because they're good policy. When your entire platform is built around opposing the other guy, even agreeing with them on something widely accepted as good policy starts to feel like a betrayal of your own cause. At the start of the video, I explained that smoking rates in 2023-2024 failed to meaningfully decline. With recent legislation being repealed and think tanks undermining these regulations by casting doubt on cigarette safety studies, it's no surprise that progress has stalled. So I want to talk about the harm that this stall in progress is contributing to. Because tobacco causes a menagerie of harms, we're going to focus on two big ones, which is lung cancer and oral cancer. Data from the Ministry of Health and Te Whatu Ora gives us the number of cancers diagnosed from 1945 to 2020. To account for population increases, I actually calculated the percentages for incidence of both cancers. That is, what percentage of all cancers are lung or oral cancers? That's the question I wanted to ask. What we can see is that rates of lung cancer increased substantially over the late 40s and peaked around the year 1960, where it remained fairly steady until the 1990s. Between the 1990s and now, lung cancer rates have dropped by almost a third. For oral cancers, we can see a similar trend, but with a large cliff between the 40s and 60s. Now, I assume, but can confirm, that this cliff is born out of people switching from chewing tobacco, pipes, and cigars to cigarettes. Much like with rates of lung cancers, we see a decline in oral cancers after the 1990s, with a slight increase in the 2000s and 2010s, although never reaching the same heights we've seen in previous decades. All of this is to say, anti-smoking measures have had huge impacts in the number of lives preserved. For lung cancer, there was a drop of 5% between 1990 and 2000, or, thereabouts if we're rounding it up nicely. I think it's worth stepping back from just smoking for a moment. It's a major factor in cancers, but it's not the only one. Environmental pollutants, secondhand smoke, red meat, we know that plenty of other carcinogens exist beyond smoking. Plus, cancer diagnostic tools have greatly improved over time, so it's reasonable to assume that at least part of the increase in cases comes down to better detection rather than a true rise in incidence. So that's the incidence. That's just how much of all cancer is lung or oral cancer. But let's look at the deaths, where things are a little bit bleaker. I just want to say, though, that the data for cancer deaths seemingly ends at 2018, so we unfortunately don't have much modern information to use here. So let's start with oral cancer. How many cancer deaths are oral, lip, or pharynx cancer deaths? We can once again see a cliff at the start of the graph, with rates declining steady until the 1980s. There's a huge dip in the 90s until things ease up and plateau out in the 2000s, until seemingly rising again in the late 2010s. Overall, though, the oral cancer deaths never make up more than 3% of all cancer deaths. Lung cancer is a much sadder chart to look at. From the day statistics began until 1980, we see a steep climb up. The peak for lung cancer deaths was in 1984, when 21.8% of all cancer deaths, 1,282 people, died from lung cancer. There is a very faint glimmer of hope. Since 1992, no year has had such a high percentage of lung cancer deaths. But we're still at 1970 levels, and the percentage of lung cancer-related deaths is still incredibly high in proportion to other cancers. It would be really easy to look at these graphs and just assume that tobacco control measures haven't had much of an impact. The dips in cancer rates do not track with the number of people who have quit smoking. The thing is, plenty of opportunists jump on this and argue that the link between smoking and lung cancer is weak. Downplaying or outright denying that connection has been a long-standing tobacco industry tactic, and ironically is one that's sometimes bolstered by anti-tobacco messaging. Public health campaigns emphasize the body's ability to heal after quitting, which is great and should absolutely continue. But the tobacco lobby twists that message, pointing at lung cancer rates and saying, if quitting helps the lungs recover and so many people have quit, why haven't lung cancer rates dropped proportionately? Maybe smoking and lung cancer aren't actually related. The thing is, it's an argument that almost sounds reasonable until you actually think about it. If you consider how quickly smoking rates have dropped, the natural lifespan of those already affected, and the time it takes to recover from tobacco-related harm, it's kind of clear why we haven't seen a drastic decline in lung cancer rates yet. In fact, I don't think we'll see a meaningful dip in these charts for at least another generation or two, maybe longer, maybe never. A 2020 study published in Clinical Epigenetics found that a father smoking before conception, especially during puberty, can lead to DNA changes in his children. These DNA changes increase the risk of asthma, poor lung function, and obesity regardless of whether the child or their mother ever smoked cigarettes. In other words, even if smoking disappeared overnight and an entire generation never touched tobacco, the damage is already done. There's no putting the toothpaste back in the bag here. And I can't help but wonder if this plays into the whole "kids today are sicker than we used to be" narrative. You hear people say we never had this disease or that disease back in my day, but if we look at the data, tobacco consumption peaked in 1963 and stayed high for nearly 20 years before dropping off dramatically. That means for 2 decades, countless parents passed down DNA altered by smoking at a rate never seen before and not seen since. I'm not trying to dismiss valid concerns about the contemporary lifestyle. There are countless factors at play. But if a significant portion of the population had their genetic makeup altered by tobacco exposure, it stands to reason that the generations following peak tobacco use would see more of these inherited health complications. And since epigenetic changes can be passed down, these effects may not simply fade away over time. So we've covered how those previous graphs could be misinterpreted by the tobacco lobby, and we've also discussed how Atlas pays to have pro-tobacco books written on their behalf. But the train of junk science keeps chugging along. A 2021 study authored by researchers at the Department of Economics at the University of Huelva and the Universidad Internacional de La Rioja in Spain got into detail about the approach Philip Morris has taken to its IQOS devices and the HTP market, at least within the Spanish context. Heated tobacco products are marketed as a less harmful alternative, but as the study made abundantly clear, there is no rigid scientific agreement on this claim. The study used data analysis to show that Philip Morris International has replaced many of its traditional cigarette brands in Spain with HEETS, a type of heated tobacco product. However, unlike in Japan, the shift from regular cigarettes to heated tobacco products in Spain has not been as widespread. There were 2 key takeaways for Spanish health and tax authorities. 1. Many smokers are switching to heated tobacco because they believe it is less harmful, but there is uncertainty about its actual health impact. And 2. PMI appears to be using heated tobacco products to gain tax advantages. Heated tobacco in Spain is currently taxed at 46%, whereas traditional cigarettes would be taxed at 61% at the same price. This tax gap has resulted in nearly 100 million euros lost in tax revenue. It's this bottom one that we should be focusing on. So let's go back to Casey Costello. On July 1st, 2024, Casey Costello, who also serves as Customs Minister, quietly implemented a 50% reduction in excise tax on heated tobacco products.
Associate Health Minister Casey Costello has delivered a 50% cut to the excise tax rate on heated tobacco products. The Ministry of Health advice shows that officials are opposed to those ideas. Right, Guy, and tell us what is going on now. Let's start with this cut to the excise tax.
Yeah, so Casey Costello, who's also the Customs Minister, we should note, has cut the excise tax by 50% effective from the 1st of July for these heated tobacco products. This is a move that was silently dropped on the Customs website rather than any press release or announcement.
Costello also declined interviews but stated through a spokesperson that the goal was to lower the cost of HTPs, making them a more accessible alternative for smokers looking to quit. However, Professor Janet Hook from the University of Otago criticized the decision, suggesting it appeared to benefit the tobacco industry rather than public health. Documents reveal that Philip Morris, the dominant player in New Zealand's HTP market with its IQOS device, had long lobbied for lower taxes on HTPs. In 2018, the company had advised the tax working group that the government should significantly reduce the tax rate on HTPs, lowering them to below traditional cigarettes. Costello has justified her decision by drawing parallels between HTPs and vaping, arguing that while vaping has been effective in reducing smoking rates, some individuals struggle to quit through vaping alone. She suggested that HTPs, which have a similar risk profile to vapes, might be another viable alternative. However, the Ministry of Health strongly opposed relaxing regulations on HTPs, stating there is no substantial evidence that supports their effectiveness as a smoking cessation tool. Officials warned that liberalizing HTP policies could increase youth addiction and nicotine dependence. The ministry specifically advised against allowing greater promotion of HTPs, citing concerns about their appeal to young people and the broader risks of nicotine addiction. In December of 2023, Costello submitted a document to health officials advocating for tobacco tax cuts. The document claimed that nicotine was no more harmful than caffeine and dismissed Labour's smoke-free policies as nanny-state nonsense. Initially, Costello denied the document's existence. However, after Radio New Zealand obtained a leaked version, she was compelled to release a redacted version under the Official Information Act. The unredacted version, which Radio New Zealand already possessed, revealed that the redactions were primarily made to conceal arguments supporting tax cuts for HTPs. Costello said she did not know who authored the document or how it ended up in her office, stating it was received as a hard copy on December 6, 2023. She insisted that neither she nor her office had any connections to the tobacco industry. However, Labour's Aisha Verrill found these arguments implausible, particularly given Costello's past career as a detective.
Dr. Aisha Verrill.
With respect to the mystery of who wrote the document that appeared on her desk, has she considered calling in a former detective to investigate?
Mr. Speaker, no.
The Chief Ombudsman ruled that Costello had acted contrary to law. That's the French pronunciation for fucking illegal, and withholding information, and forced her to apologize. The Ombudsman further criticized Costello's handling of the mystery document. He found it concerning that Costello could not provide any records about its origin and noted that her explanation, claiming the document was compiled over time from various sources, was inconsistent with the evidence. Notably, the document contained excerpts from the coalition agreement, proving it was completed after the coalition government was formed. While Costello intended for more than 7,000 smokers to switch to HTPs as part of the Smokefree 2025 initiative, her plan hit a major obstacle. Philip Morris, the sole supplier of HTPs in New Zealand, was forced to pull its IQOS device from the market due to regulatory changes that took effect on October 1, 2024. These regulations, initially introduced by the previous Labour government, required all vaping devices to have removable batteries and child safety mechanisms. Costello had unsuccessfully lobbied for a 2-year delay to accommodate international manufacturers, but Cabinet only agreed to a 6-month postponement. As a result, IQOS devices became non-compliant with the new rules and were withdrawn from sale, though the tobacco sticks used in the devices remain available. Philip Morris has not confirmed when a compliant device will be reintroduced to the market, further complicating Costello's policy. Critics have pointed out that official advice contradicts Costello's claim that HTPs are as safe as vaping. In fact, government documents state that HTPs are more harmful than vapes and lack strong evidence as a smoking cessation tool. In our last video, we went over the school lunch program, which has seen $170 million wiped from its budget in Seymour's effort to cosplay as Javier Milei. When Costello slashed the excise taxes on HTPs by 50%, she also set aside a contingency fund of $216 million to cover the tobacco tax cuts. That's almost the budget of the entire school lunch program given as tax breaks to Philip fucking Morris. The kiddies are eating plastic so that tobacco CEOs can author more junk science books via Atlas. In the aforementioned document, a comparison was made between nicotine and caffeine, which seems dubious. This claim seems to have been popularized by John Britton, who is the director of the UK Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies, University of Nottingham.
The e-cigarette market is growing fast. The number of users expected to reach 1 million this year. Some medical experts see huge potential benefits.
Nicotine itself is not a particularly hazardous drug, something on a par with the effects that you get from caffeine.
Professor John Britton leads the Tobacco Advisory Group for the Royal College of Physicians.
If all the smokers in Britain stopped smoking cigarettes and started smoking e-cigarettes, we would save 5 million deaths in people who are alive today.
He's made this claim a few times, but he's not the first person to make it. It's been debunked time and again for almost 50 years. In a response given to an interview by John Britton, the Center for Tobacco Control at the University of California, San Francisco published a rebuttal that referred to a 2014 Surgeon General's report. This report makes the following clear. 1. At high doses, nicotine can be toxic. 2. Nicotine activates biological processes that increase the risk of disease. 3. Exposure to nicotine during fetal development can cause long-term harm to brain development. 4. Nicotine negatively affects both mother and baby during pregnancy, increasing the risk of preterm birth and stillbirth. 5. There is evidence that nicotine exposure in adolescents may have long-term negative effects on brain development. And 6. While nicotine itself may not directly cause cancer, it reacts with other chemicals to form strong carcinogens. The 1988 Surgeon General's report on nicotine addiction also directly refuted the nicotine-caffeine comparison. It reviewed studies showing that many addictive drugs like alcohol, morphine, amphetamines, cocaine, and nicotine were strongly self-administered by both humans and animals. Caffeine, on the other hand, did not trigger the same compulsive drug-seeking behavior. The proponents of vapes and HTPs can and should point to the combustion of cigarettes as being a major driver of the harm that cigarettes do to the human body. It's the chemical interactions between nicotine and other chemicals that create tobacco-specific nitromazines, which are powerful carcinogens. Nicotine, in isolation, obviously, is nowhere near as bad as nicotine being combusted in a cigarette. Let's make sure we're on the same page on that. Smoking anything is bad for you. But what bothers me about HTPs and vapes is that they can, not always, but can, facilitate people into smoking cigarettes. In 2017, researchers at the Pennsylvania State University published a study on the link between vaping and traditional cigarette use in adolescents. This study used data from the 2014 National Youth Tobacco Survey, which included 22,007 middle and high school students in the United States aged between 11 and 19. They identified that adolescents who used e-cigarettes were more likely to smoke traditional cigarettes, and this link was the strongest in early adolescence. 12-year-olds using e-cigarettes were much more likely to also smoke traditional cigarettes than their peers who did not. The connection weakens in older adolescents but still remains significant. This study is supported by a 2018 study published through the JAMA network, a medical journal published by the American Medical Association. The study focused on 6,123 participants between the ages of 12 and 15 from 2013 to 2016. These participants had never used any tobacco products at the start of the study. This study found that young people who started using tobacco with e-cigarettes were more than 4 times as likely to try cigarettes later on and nearly 3 times as likely to become regular cigarette smokers within 2 years. It also found that using other types of tobacco products, like cigars or hookah, were also linked to a similar increase in cigarette smoking. However, the link between e-cigarette use and later cigarette smoking was especially strong among teens who were otherwise low risk, meaning they did not have a history of risk-taking behavior. This pattern was not seen with other tobacco products and suggests that e-cigarettes may be playing a bigger role in leading young people to start smoking than all other tobacco products combined. Based on the study's national sample, the authors estimate that between 2013 and 2016, approximately 178,850 young people in the United States started smoking cigarettes because they first tried e-cigarettes, and about 43,446 people became regular smokers this way. They suggested that cigarette smoking rates among 15-year-olds in 2016 could have been about 0.7% lower if e-cigarettes were not available. I want to end this chapter by making my point clear. We cannot ease up on tobacco regulation. Smoking is in its ember stage. It's mostly gone, but if those embers are allowed to burn unchecked, the fire of tobacco will flare up again. Do you remember synthetics? Sins. You know, synthetic weed. We can all agree they weren't good, right? Cheap, vile, chemical-sodden grass tastes like embalming fluid, heavily addictive and insanely damaging to the human brain. We remember those, right? I'm not talking BZP, I'm talking the second and third generation of sins.
Well, first of all, it came out in the shops and stuff, and I thought that, it was yucky, it didn't really do anything for me, and yeah, I used to mock the shit out of the other cunts down in Henderson, oh my God, just smoke the real shit, bro, you're so stupid, that shit's just gonna fuck up your brain.
Synthetic cannabinoids started gaining popularity sometime around 2011 and 2012. However, in July 2013, the national government passed a law banning the sale of legal highs in dairies and supermarkets, but it allowed some low-risk drugs to continue to be sold through specialty licensed shops. Now, around this time, a game of cat and mouse started unfolding where the government would ban one specific compound only for the manufacturers to tweak it slightly and allow it to continue to be sold on the market. What ended up happening was an avalanche of increasingly distorted versions of the highs that customers were buying a year prior. Finally, after a year of the market being flooded with unknown mystery chemicals, the national government outlawed all legal highs in May of 2014. And all drugs went away and no one ever did drugs ever again.
A bad batch of synthetic drugs affecting Christchurch is now being blamed for killing at least one person. St John Ambulance today revealed that a recent death is being linked to the same synthetic drugs which have put another 19 people in hospital.
Doctors and police are heading out harder after the chief coroner revealed an alarming number of deaths linked to synthetic cannabis. Judge Deborah Marshall says as many as 75 people died in a 2-year period from the toxic effects of the highly addictive drug.
But highly addictive synthetics are still widely available and very cheap.
Because it is so addictive, they can't leave it, and they go back to it, and they go back to it, and they go back to it.
Cinnies haven't gone anywhere. Cannabis, the drug that Cinnies are aping, also hasn't gone anywhere. And if you've looked at meth use in the wastewater recently, you'll know that methamphetamine use doubled in the latter half of 2024. Prohibition is not good policy. People turn to synthetics because they didn't have access to legal cannabis. I don't think outright prohibiting tobacco or vapes or HTPs is going to snuff tobacco out for good. I think the Labour government under Jacinda Ardern had a pretty rock-solid plan for the future of tobacco. I don't think that tobacco should ever be outright prohibited, but I also don't think that it should be widely available for purchase. If people want to grow, cure, and smoke their own tobacco for personal use, then that's up to them. As long as they're not exposing others to their secondhand smoke, I don't really see an issue. The same goes for vapes and HTPs. I don't think that they should be banned, but big tobacco has zero place in this conversation. Philip Morris, British American Tobacco, and every other multinational tobacco giant, they've done irreparable harm. Not just to public health, but to politics and our understanding of nicotine's danger. And why? It's simply to dodge the taxes that they should be paying to clean up the mess that their products cause. I'm not alone in this sentiment either. Dr. Ashley Bloomfield made it clear in 2019 that his response to Philip Morris's offers to quote-unquote help was thanks, but no thanks. Past public health, the 2011 study from San Diego State University found that leachate that comes from used cigarette butts is highly toxic to the two types of fish they tested, which were the saltwater topsmelt and the freshwater fathead minnow. That's a really mean name. One unexpected finding was that even brand new, unused cigarette filters with no tobacco were also toxic to both fish species. It took 5.1 filters per liter of water to be lethal for half of the topsmelt and 13.5 filters per liter of water for the fathead minnow. I'm bringing this up because it seems like all nicotine products create an absurd amount of waste. The Office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor wrote in 2019 that cigarette butts account for nearly 78% of all items littered in Aotearoa. Then you've got the batteries from vapes and all the plastic packaging that comes with those, and tobacco itself. With that, there's the used HTP sticks, which are basically just giant cigarette butts. I think all nicotine products should be taxed proportionate to the level of harm they cause to society. I think it's gross that more than $200 million was put aside for tax cuts for nicotine. So, I don't know what the right answer is beyond what Labour already had going for them. In these videos, I like to ask why. I try to put myself into the shoes of the people I'm discussing to try to understand their motives. I like to operate under the belief that everyone thinks that they're the good guy, and so I believe that understanding someone's self-perceived nobility is the first step in figuring out where to push back. So let's do that in real time. What is the self-perceived nobility in dismantling tobacco control laws? Well, if I were someone pushing for the repeal of tobacco regulations, I'd probably see myself as defending smokers' rights to make that decision for themselves. I'd probably think that it's about the freedom to choose. Fighting for self-determination, it's a noble cause, and I agree with it. I wholeheartedly believe that people should have the right to decide what they do with their own bodies. But if we step out of their shoes and back into our own, we can see that it's not that simple. Addiction, by definition, isn't a choice. Yet for decades, people's choices have been shaped, if not outright manipulated, by marketing, branding, and unethical industry practices. Big Tobacco has spent untold millions distorting the idea of personal choice to serve its own interests, and not all of its tactics have been legal. Take, for example, a 1976 case in Aotearoa. That year, Philip Morris's Kiwi branch appeared in the Wellington Magistrates Court charged with breaching the Gaming Act. The company had secretly placed $10,000, equivalent to about $100,000 today, in small banknotes inside cigarette packets as a promotional stunt. A month later, in January 1977, the court ruled the practice to be illegal and ordered it to stop. Philip Morris was convicted and fined $200, or about $1,900 today. But the company didn't stop pushing boundaries. Just 6 months after that, it was back under police scrutiny for a new promotion: cigarette packets containing random words that smokers could collect and redeem for prizes. Authorities suspected that the contest once again violated the Gaming Act of 1908. Auckland police warned that anyone involved in advertising the competition, including newspapers and retailers, could face prosecution under Section 63 of the Act. As a result, newspapers and the Newspaper Publishers Association refused to run the ads. So, to reiterate a point I made last time, I believe in self-determination, but self-determination simply is not possible in a society saturated with pro-industry propaganda. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that smoking is a purely personal choice. Fine, but what about the children of smokers? We know that fathers who smoke before conception can alter their future children's DNA, increasing their risk of disease. How do the children of smokers reconcile their lifelong health issues with their parents' personal choice to smoke cigarettes? Is the only reasonable option to restrict smoking to only men who have had vasectomies? And even then, what about second-hand or third-hand smoke? Which finally brings us back to privatization. This is often framed as an extension of the personal choice argument. If I were someone pushing for privatization, I'd probably believe that expanding private healthcare would lead to more hospitals, more competition, and lower prices. And if I were also someone repealing smoking laws, I'd probably see this as shifting the burden away from taxpayers and onto smokers, forcing them to take personal responsibility. But personal responsibility is a term I absolutely detest. Let's zoom out. If you believe in personal choice, then logically, the flip side of that is personal responsibility. So, do tobacco CEOs not have to take responsibility for their choice to lie? I would also argue that smokers already take financial responsibility. According to revenue data from the Treasury, smokers paid $2.1 billion in tobacco excise taxes in 2021. With only approximately 300,000 smokers left in 2024-2025, I'd say the tax burden has been more than covered. So I'm left wondering, is cutting tobacco taxes a way to make the argument that smoking taxes don't cover healthcare costs? Is it just to justify privatization in the mind of its proponents? Which leads us to a bigger question. What's the real purpose of privatization? For me, it seems like it's just another way to turn smoking-related disease into profit for the same people who love donating to right-wing politicians. And for smokers who can't afford care, well, they'll either end up disabled, trapped in low-wage jobs, or pushed into crime just to survive until they inevitably get funneled into the private prison system where, once again, they generate profit for the same political donors. The idea that Big Tobacco would double dip, profiting from both causing and treating smoking-related illness, this isn't speculation. It's not a theory, it's not a vibe, it is reality. A 1978 article from the press outlined how multinational corporations shape healthcare policies to serve their own interests. Professor John McKinley, a New Zealand-born medical planner, warned that much of the country's healthcare spending was based on untested assumptions rather than proven effectiveness. He pointed out that major companies like General Electric, Xerox, Esso, Boeing, and IBM had become major players in healthcare, pushing expensive medical technology onto the public, often backed by lobbying and state funding. Philip Morris was one of the companies named in this article, specifically for selling a machine for lung congestion relief. Vectura Group is a British healthcare company that specializes in the production of inhalation devices such as nebulizers and inhalers, which are commonly used to treat respiratory illnesses, including those caused by tobacco use. In September of 2021, the Vectura Group was sold to Philip Morris International. The rationale behind Philip Morris's acquisition of Vectura is clear: to expand its revenue streams beyond nicotine-related products. This approach isn't a new one for Philip Morris. As smoking rates began to decline in the 1970s and the health risks of tobacco became impossible to ignore, Philip Morris took strategic steps to diversify beyond cigarettes. The company's first major acquisition came in 1970 with the purchase of Miller Brewing Company, marking the beginning of a series of investments outside the tobacco industry. By 1972, Philip Morris expanded further, acquiring Southern California's Mission Viejo Company, a home-building firm, for $52 million, a venture that it would hold on to until 1997. Philip Morris continued its diversification efforts through the 1980s. In 1985, it restructured as a holding company under the name Philip Morris Companies Incorporated, becoming the parent of its own tobacco division. This move set the stage for its acquisition of General Foods that same year. 3 years after, in 1988, Philip Morris expanded further into the food industry by purchasing Kraft Foods, merging it with General Foods to form Kraft General Foods. As the company entered the 2000s, its non-tobacco ventures grew increasingly significant. 2002 saw Miller Brewing merge with South African breweries to form SAB Miller, making it the world's second largest beer producer. Philip Morris retained a stake in this new entity. A massive rebranding took place in 2003 as Philip Morris Companies officially changed its name to Altria Group, a move aimed at distancing itself from its tobacco-centric image while still owning 100% of Philip Morris USA. This lasted about 4 years until 2007 when Altria finally spun off Kraft Foods, marking a significant move away from the food industry. That same year, 2007, Altria acquired cigar manufacturer John Middleton Company, a deal finalized in 2008. In 2009, Altria expanded into the smokeless tobacco market with its acquisition of UST Incorporated, the parent company of U.S. Smokeless Tobacco Company and wine producer Chateau Ste. Michelle. This acquisition ended a brief period of competition between Altria's newly developed Marlboro smokeless products and UST Incorporated's established brands. By the late 2010s, Altria had begun aggressively investing in alternative nicotine products. On December 8, 2018, the company announced its intent to acquire a 45% stake in the Canadian cannabis company Cronos Group for $1.8 billion. Less than 2 weeks later, on December the 20th, Altria finalized a massive $12.8 billion investment in Juul Labs, acquiring a 35% stake in the e-cigarette company. However, this investment soon proved disastrous. By November 2019, Altria wrote down $4.5 billion of its stake, and by July 2022, the investment had lost 95% of its original value. Despite these losses, Altria continued supporting Juul and refrained from investing in competing products. In June 2019, Altria further expanded its nicotine portfolio by investing $372 million in the global business of Swiss tobacco company Burgerson, acquiring a stake in its Helix Innovations division, known for the On brand of nicotine pouches. Then, on October 27, 2022, Altria and Japan Tobacco announced a joint venture called Horizon Innovations LLC, intending to bring plume heated tobacco sticks to the US market, pending FDA approval by 2025 and full consumer availability by 2027. Most recently, on June 1, 2023, Altria completed the acquisition of Enjoy Holdings Incorporated, further solidifying its commitment to the evolving nicotine market. What I'm getting at is this. Philip Morris built massive wealth in the 1950s and 60s by discrediting scientists. They used that wealth to diversify as the evidence mounted in the 1970s and 80s. They stayed afloat and funded think tanks in the 90s and 2000s. They cashed out their investments in the mid-2000s to secure their fortune and then swept up smokeless nicotine companies in the 2010s, catapulting them back to extraordinary highs in the 2020s. All of this is to say, Philip Morris is a beast. We can attack it, but unless its fire is truly extinguished, it will bide its time in the shadows, living off the spoils of its harms until the time is right to rear back up and put tobacco back into the mainstream. So I try to end these videos with a question. Today's question is this. Do you think that this is worth it? Is rolling back these laws, letting big tobacco tighten its grip on our politics, worth the environmental damage, the health crises, and the permanent genetic impact on future generations? Is it worth putting another generation of children at risk just so big tobacco and its allies can keep lining their pockets? Is it worth slashing $170 million from the school lunch budget while setting aside $260 million for tobacco tax cuts? Is it worth it? Because I just don't think that it is.